nutrition. So you really need to overprepare.
Yes.
But you can't because of health and safety.
Yeah, that's what we need to see. Yeah, you have to have it sold out because
But like you're not supposed to anywhere because if they all turn up, then you're gonna
you have to have it sold out. If they do, it's health and safety.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this sunny afternoon to come sit in a darkened room. It's very much appreciated. This panel that we're having this afternoon is part of the Festival of Future Cities, which is an endeavor of the Bristol Festival of Ideas, a year-long program that brings some of the world's leading artists, critics, thinkers, intellectuals, public figures to Bristol. The Festival of the Future City has been running over the last 3 days, and it aims to be the largest public debate about the future of cities in the world. It brings together politicians, writers, artists, scientists, changemakers, academics, journalists, students, the public, economists, futurists, and all sorts of other people to debate the issues which are central to the future of the city in the 21st century. My name is Madhu Krishnan. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol, and a lot of my own work is actually about the production of space and the constitution of spatiality, so I'm very delighted to be chairing today's panel on race, gender, and the future of cities, organized in partnership with the Black Southwest Network as part of the There Is Black in the Union Jack project. Many thanks particularly to Sato Girde, director of the Black Southwest Network, for organizing the event and providing its guiding vision. Women of color have often been at the forefront of movements to create more humane and integrated policies and places, evidenced in social justice movements over time and across the world. In this panel, we think about what historic and global movements for change can teach us about the future of cities, and how centering our vision of the future city on the experience and lives of women of color might enable us to think the future of cities differently. We have a wonderful panel of expert speakers, so just to give you a few notes about the format of today's event, we're going to begin with each panelist giving an opening statement, drawing from their own expertise in this area, and then we'll have a brief discussion amongst ourselves. We'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions from the audience, so do start thinking about what you would like to ask our wonderful panelists. So we're just going to make a start. Our first panelist today is Dr. Sumita Mukherjee, who is a senior lecturer in the history of migration at the University of Bristol. Her research focuses on the British Empire and the Indian subcontinent, and she writes about the history of South Asians in Britain, the history of women's rights in India, and the global effects of Indian migration. She's particularly interested in issues of representation, identity, and nationalism, as well as the effects of travel and use of imperial and global networks. Please join me in welcoming Sumita.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you to the Black Southwest Network for inviting me to be here. I've got some prepared comments that I just want to make, and really these comments, I'm a historian, so they're really about challenges to the ways in which we think about Black and BME history, especially in Britain, and the ways in which we can think about women of colour who, as Madhu said, have been at the forefront of so much social and political change. So as Madhu said, one of the things I do, I work on the histories of South Asian migration, and really the histories of people from the Indian subcontinent who came to Britain before the Second World War. A lot of Black or Asian British histories focus rightly on the contributions of BME individuals and communities in the post-Windrush era. But what I've tried to do is highlight that there are much more long-standing contributions that, in my area particularly, people from the Indian subcontinent and people of Indian descent have made to British life for centuries, to British culture, society, and politics. And also some of the connections and cross-racial solidarity between different BME groups in British history. And so as the There Is Black in the Union Jack project is showing, to truly talk about British history or British identity, we need to include BME people and BME histories into that. Not as separate niche histories, but part of a mainstream discussion when we talk about Britishness and about British cities as well as Festival of Future Cities. I hope I'm preaching to the converted here. But ideally, we shouldn't need to talk about some Black British history or Asian British history as separate things, but part and parcel of British history more broadly. And this is really crucial, especially for BME people today in Britain to know and feel that they are part of a shared British history. It's important for all British people to know and understand that shared British history and that shared collectiveness. And I'm going to say this because I'm a historian, but I think history is really powerful for this. The symbols, the statues, the myths, the stories that we tell and perpetuate about history play a crucial role in how national identity is formed and projected, and how people feel a part of a community or a city or a shared collective. Young and older people also look to and need role models, and they often therefore look to history and draw these role models from history. And history is contested. We know this, for example, in Bristol with statues and so forth, but it's often through historical role models that people are inspired to follow in their footsteps, to take part in social and political and civic life, to put themselves forward in leadership positions, whether it stand for political election, to get involved in social and political campaign movements, or in professional arenas as well. But I want to challenge this a little bit. Because within discussions about Black or BME history, we clearly need to think about gender and the roles and the histories and stories we tell about BME women. In programmes like Black History Month and there is Blackening Union Jack Project, there are now more concerted efforts to draw out examples of women who have played leading roles in historical change. And I can list examples. I can mention Olive Morris, I can mention Claudia Jones, I can mention Althea Jones-LeCointe, I can mention Jaiben Desai, I can mention Diane Abbott. I'm not going to, hopefully some of those names are familiar to you. I'm not going to give you a potted history of all of them. But these are examples of people from the 1970s or after. If I wanted to draw from an earlier history, it's slightly more difficult to think of British examples, but I can think of a few. Sophia Dilip-Singh was an Indian, was a woman of Indian and Ethiopian descent who was involved in the British suffrage movement in the 1910s. Una Marston was a Jamaican poet and activist who was involved in lots of interwar activism and joined the BBC in the 1940s. African-American abolitionist Sarah Raymond was also involved in suffrage movements in the 19th century. But there are challenges about how we draw upon a longer history of BME women who took up leadership roles and enacted change that go back a century or more. Because we have so many more examples of BME men, even though they are also limited, but we do have more examples of men who have been involved in historical change. And there are two issues here to why we find it difficult to draw out women. One is the unacknowledged role of women in social and political change and in social political movements, and the other one is about the women's movement, and especially if we think about women who are involved in gender equality movements and kind of the issues around how women's movements have failed to address intersectional challenges of race and gender and class. So in relation to the first issue of the unacknowledged role of women in movements, there was a report last week published by the Rana-Deshmukh Trust and Women's Budget Group, which showed how BME women have been hit hardest by austerity here in Britain. That in the poorest group of households, BME households were losing out more than white households, and there are a number of reasons for this. One of the reasons for this is that BME women are more likely to take on caring roles for relatives who would previously have been entitled to adult social care, and BME women are more likely to have dependent children that they need to take care of, whether in single parent or in joint parent families. And it's this caring role of women, the role of women as mothers and taking care of the household and taking care of household budgets, while men often go out and take up the prominent leadership roles that history has remembered, that we need to think about. Because behind many great white and BME men, there are women who are holding the fort behind them. So we need to move beyond histories that just celebrate individuals, that just celebrate the pioneers, the first woman who stood for election or the first woman who led an organisation, but to celebrate families and communities, to highlight the small-scale ways in which BME women have and continue to make changes in some of the unacknowledged groups of women. For example, the ways in which the NHS, from its inception and to today, has been built upon the work of BME nurses. And then the second issue then, about the women's movement historically and today, which still continues to have challenges in addressing intersectional issues around women of colour and issues of class as well. I've got a book coming out later next year about Indian suffrage campaigners and their role in the networks of suffrage around the world. And in talking to young BME women about suffrage and the women's movement and historical movements for women's rights, I've often been told, and we've often had discussions about how young BME women just don't feel inspired by white middle class women who have fought for political rights. And this is a continuing issue. So we can find some examples of BME women in Britain or America who've been involved in political change, but perhaps we need to think beyond Britain and America. So I'm really concerned about the Western-centric focus of history, of the role models that we draw upon. I mean, the media just generally is so Western-centric, as I'm sure you'll realise. So the final point I'd like to make is that perhaps, especially in global cities like Bristol, with so many of us from migrant backgrounds from around the world, or migrant descent, that we need to think about our history, our shared history, as a global history. That we don't need to only focus on BME contributions to British history, but think of the interconnections and our shared history with women around the world, to draw upon the inspiration of women pioneers who've led social and political movements in other parts of the world as well, whether in India, women who were campaigning for suffrage 100 years ago today, whether we think about women who were involved in the ANC in South Africa, fighting against apartheid, women who are fighting for education rights in Indonesia and all around the world. And really using all these examples together to give inspiration to BME women in our cities, so they can think of that, so we can all think of that shared collective history that we all have, and to use those role models and the unacknowledged role models that we have to really inspire BME women to take a more active role in cities today.
Thank you, Sumita. Our second panelist today is Aisha Rana-Deshmukh. Aisha is currently a geography student, and she is also BME officer at the University of Bristol. And she spent the past year working in student services and as a student researcher at the Bristol Students' Union. The BME Attainment Gap Project was a project she conducted research for with the union, and the results are depressingly familiar. Its aims were to investigate the causes of the attainment gap in Bristol that existed between BME students and their white peers, and explored the BME student experience at the University of Bristol. Her current work includes addressing the issues raised in the report and ensuring that the recommendations are followed through. As BME officer, she works to advocate for BME student rights, including working with the university to fight racism and discrimination, and most importantly, to empower BME students. Welcome, Aisha. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thanks to Bristol Southwest for inviting me to speak. Sumita, that was amazing. I think I'm going to bring quite a contemporary perspective on what we're looking at. I think that drawing on the report, BME individuals, the experience that we have, and women of colour specifically, in an institution like the university, it's a very troubling thing that we are looking at. Things that I found in the report were things like isolation, BME students not being able to be themselves, things like racism, microaggressions, like Sumita was saying, lack of representation, not being able to see someone look like you succeed, therefore there's a lack of inspiration and engagement of BME individuals. And then things like white curriculum and lack of mental health support for BME individuals. So what I want to talk about is, as women of colour, as we navigate these institutional spaces, it can be very difficult, and women of colour are often at the forefront of movements, such as Malia, who was the NUS president last year. She pioneered so many things, worked hard, fought for BME individuals, against Islamophobia, things like that, but then she suffered from onslaught of criticism, and I believe that was because she's a woman of colour and because she was one of the first Muslim presidents of the NUS. And it's these women who are putting themselves in these situations, fighting for the rights of their peers, and they don't get the recognition, the support, and it often leads to us either getting consumed by the cause or just like falling apart from it. And that's what I want to focus on, that student movements led by women of colour aren't given the support that they need. A lot of what we do is free. Luckily, the report I wrote was paid, but as BME officer, everything I do is for free. I just work really hard, things like Black History Month. If we weren't organising something, then the university wouldn't have had any events for students, which I found quite ironic. And I think that it's something that either the work that we do, it can either be tokenized and taken as like a tick box action, so invited to be speaking at events and things like that. It's just to give that BME perspective, the woman of colour, we can tick that on our box. Or we're either exploited and we're just used as free labour, as something that the university or an institution or a company can be like, we're diverse, we stand for equality, etc. I think with regards to the future, a lot of within research and looking at equality, inequality and injustice, a lot of it is like it's very statistic heavy and it's not been taken as a route to go forward. So things like Theresa May's race audit, it's a very statistically heavy thing, and for me it only like superficially addressed the problem of inequality. And like Sumita was saying, BME women are the worst hit by things like austerity imposed by the Tory government. It's something that, it's an empty gesture. It can allude to them attempting to solve the issue of inequality without having to do anything or acknowledge the structural racism or discrimination that it perpetuates. And it ignores, again, the intersectionality between race and gender. It is different to be a woman of colour in these spaces than a man of colour or a white person. So it's something that, going forward into the future and looking how we do these schemes, projects, outreach, widening participation, so many of all these things that we're trying to get more BME like engagement in. We need to think about whether we're doing that productively or whether we're doing it superficially without really actually serving purpose to who we're trying to help. I think that's where I'm going to leave it.
Thank you so much, Aisha. So our third panelist today is Nicole Truesdell. Nicole is the Senior Director of Academic Diversity and Inclusiveness and Assistant Professor of Critical Identity Studies at Belmont College in the United States. She did her PhD in anthropology at Michigan State University, and her interests are in radical pedagogy, academic hustling, and social justice. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, racism, gender, class, citizenship, and belonging, nationalism and the nation state, community organizing, activism, social movements, and radical Black thought. She has worked with the Black Southwest Network since 2009 and helped develop and write 3 of the 4 Heritage Lottery-funded projects BSWN has completed. Welcome all the way from America, Nicole. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So good afternoon. Good afternoon. There you go. All right, there we go. Okay. So I want to thank everyone for coming today, and I also want to thank Sadhu. I've been working with Sadhu since 2009, as Madhu said, and it's been an interesting journey since that time. I came to the UK in order to understand the concept of race and racism out of a US context. Many times we talk about race and racism, people look to the US and or South Africa as these kind of shining examples of what it means for a state to put itself around race. But I want to say that working in the UK, some of the feedback and pushback that I received from both my institution in the US and also in the UK was that the UK didn't have a race problem. It was about class. And so in thinking about how we think about who owns race and racism and this quote unquote exceptionalism, right, that people put onto the US context, made me think about how things like the intersections of, say, race, gender, and class play out in different locations. And so when we had the opportunity to receive the funding for our last HLF project, which is There Is Black in the Union Jack, which again pays homage to and talks with Paul Gilroy's 1987 seminal piece, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. I asked Sadhu if we could have this kind of start this conversation of intersections between race and gender, and she said yes, and so here we are. So since my panelists have talked about the UK, I'm going to talk about the US context. And so why talk about race and gender in the context of future cities? And I say it's because we have to. We cannot think about and plan for the future until we have a firm and complete understanding of the past and present, for they are not only connected, but we are doomed then to make these same mistakes and displace the same people if we don't. And so for me, when we think about future city making and planning, key questions must actually frame the conversation. So who is imagining the construction of the future city? Who is left behind? Who is being displaced in order to make space for the shiny and new? And who is at the decision-making table, and is that table representative of the people who are already in the city? And if they are at the table, are their voices actually given equal weight, and are they actually believed? And so now these are the key questions that for me are fundamental in any discussion about future cities, especially in cities with diverse populations. And Bristol is one example of that in the UK. But if we're really frank, many times those at the decision-making tables do not represent those in the community who will be most affected by these changes. Now, in the U.S. context, it then falls on those marginalized communities to not just ask, but demand that their voices and experiences are seen and heard, so that they become part of these larger structural changes. Now, this is why Black women, Native women, women of color, and queer trans women have been at the front line and forefront of social change, because they and their communities are most impacted when cities decide to reimagine, reinvent, and remake themselves, or what many of us call gentrification. Now, in my hometown of Chicago, when the current mayor decided to close over 50 public schools, and public in the U.S. context means that the state funds it, in some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, mostly on the south and west side, he said that he cut the funding because the city did not have any funding to give in these locations. But somehow in this last year, he's found over $100 million to both increase the numbers of police force and build a fancy new police training center at the expense of a lack of resources in these poor Black and brown communities on the south side. So in response, it has been Black and brown women and children, especially queer and trans women, who have been on the steps of City Hall and literally in the streets and on the L's, demanding the city put its resources back into the community. It was Black and brown women, cis, queer, and trans, who worked for over 25 years to get the University of Chicago Medical Center to open a trauma unit on the south side of the city, so that those who lived in these parts of the city, again, mainly poor and working class Black and brown communities, had access to ER and trauma unit when needed, so more people did not die due to lack of access. And if you don't know the city, Chicago's built on the lake, so if the lake is here, the south side is where a majority of Black communities have settled since the Great Migration from the south. In order to access any kind of, before they demanded this, having a center here, if you were in need, the medical centers on the west side of the city. And in good traffic, that might take you an hour. So if the ambulance actually did come, which many times they didn't, to have people who had traumatic injuries to get to access of care was near impossible. And so for 25 years, these community organizations, led mostly actually by also young people, so young people's voices do matter, help move the city, and Chicago has now opened it up. So these examples show that this is what happens when those who are making the decisions at the table do not see or acknowledge the communities that have lived in these locations for years, decades, and centuries, that have made space in these locations for who they are. And so this is the problem when the questions and frameworks used to make decisions are not intersectional. So this is why understanding intersectionality matters more so now than ever when we think about race, gender, and future cities. And when I say intersectionality, I'm not just using some fancy academic buzzword, right? Instead, the concept is actually one rooted firmly on the ground and best articulated in Black feminist thought and practice. Coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, the term is both sophisticated and straightforward in its development. Crenshaw saw a large gap in American civil rights law. When a group of Black women sued General Motors for race and gender discrimination in the 1970s, the law did not understand their case because anti-discrimination law looked at race and gender separately. The women could not prove that they were discriminated based upon gender only because all women were not discriminated against. GM did hire white women. The group of women also could not claim that they were discriminated based only on race because GM also hired Black men. And so in the court's eyes, this kind of what they called a compound discrimination suit would be seen as giving preferential treatment to the black female defendants or plaintiffs. And so because of that, the law said they could not hear the case because they could not then make that type of argument to other populations. And so for Crenshaw, this case and others liked it that she used to kind of make her case about this concept of intersectionality illustrates the ways intersecting systems of oppression operate and impact those whose identities also sit in those intersections. And so for this case, race and gender operated in tandem to deny access to certain jobs for black women within General Motors. But it also showed the ways that anti-discrimination law itself was not adequate in addressing intersecting structural inequality. But the concept is not new, and Crenshaw was the first to admit this. She was able to just name a phenomenon that has always been there. This is because systems of oppression have always been there. Power is not new. Race is not new, nor is it an American problem or issue. Neither is class or gender nor sexuality, just to name a few. Black American women have talked about the ways race and gender collide in our bodies and impact our lived experiences in the world. From Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech to white abolitionists in the mid-1800s that raised the question in an open and direct way, to Dr. Anna J. Cooper and Ida B. Wells Barnett in the early 1900s, to Angela Davis and Bell Hooks in the post-1970s, to now Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opa Tometi, the founders of the Black Lives Matter network and movement. Today, Black women have always been speaking about how being both black in an anti-black world and being a woman, and for many of these people also being queer and trans in a patriarchal heteronormative society, impact how we are rendered both hyper and invisible in society. So essentially, intersectionality is about understanding where power sits in a society and how far or close one is to those power structures. So it becomes more important now than ever in this so-called globalized world to understand the way systems of oppression operate and how this differentially impacts those whose identities sit in those intersections as we think about space, place, and who is imagined to be in these future cities. And so I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks.
So I think it's been really interesting listening to all three of you talk, getting kind of a historical perspective, moving from the UK to the US to really a global context. And there's so many kind of connecting themes that emerge across all of your remarks. I mean, there was questions of power, who gets to imagine, who gets to write history, who gets to historicize. There were questions of, intersectionality and the importance of a kind of intersectional mode of questioning when we think about these issues guiding the future of cities. These questions of labor, that was something that really struck me, was all three of you really talked about the ways in which the very cities and spaces and places that we live in and make and create have to such a large extent been undergirded by the often unacknowledged, often unrecompensed labor of women of color in various ways. So I guess what I wanted to start with was kind of picking on that question, if we are thinking about these issues of race, gender, and the future of cities, what would a city where labor is made visible look like? What would a city where power becomes transparent look like? I mean, how might we even begin to imagine a space like that when we're so stuck in our current spaces?
Difficult question. I don't know, but I don't know. I'm stumped.
You're a historian. Are there examples from history?
No, the only thing that I can think of is the campaign that Selma James was involved in, the Wages for Housework campaign in the 70s, and how actually putting in housework and that kind of unacknowledged labour that one does into GDP forecasting and kind of putting it into an economic system that's just kind of perpetuating capitalist systems of wages, I guess.
I don't know, what do you think, Nicole? Because you were really, I think, driving at a lot of those questions.
Yeah. Well, I think we'd actually see a humane city. I don't think we understand humanity anymore, right? And I think this is what folks at the margins, when we center the margins, there's ways in which we can actually rediscover what humanity means in the sense that we are not invested in, we don't see people as capital, we see people as people. And so I think we actually do have examples of what this looks like. I think if we look at communities, particularly, and I'll use Chicago again as an example, because it's a very organizing city. Its foundations are built on that. You see different community groups literally carving out and making space for themselves so that there are things like community sharing, right? There are things in which it's not always money exchanging hands for goods and services. It's the reintroduction of barter systems and co-opting and thinking about how we care for children. And society cares about its citizens when they care about its children, right? Because the children become the location that can teach us what it means to be human outside of these systems. Children have not been co-opted yet by thinking of one's contributions to society as based upon what you can produce. And I think that I was in a session yesterday where a gentleman talked about production and how the US and Germany have gotten it right because we produce 25% more than a British society does by Thursday night. And it made me think, right, it's like, of course we do, because we have to show our worth by producing in order to get basic things like clean water and access to health care. So what would it look like if residents in Flint could to turn on their tap water and not see brown, right? What would it look like if kids could go to school and not be literally hungry? And where I live now in Beloit, the school district decided, because the poverty level is so deeply intense and we have a high migration population of Latinx workers from the South, and we have a poor black community and a poor white community, the whole district decided to give everyone free breakfast and free lunch. So no one was shamed when they come to school. Everyone can, at least we know that kids are getting at least 10 meals a week, right? And so I think that's what I think to reimagine and rethink future cities, we have to literally reimagine what our values are and what we're centering, which actually, if we're being really frank, means we step outside of whiteness and think about the ways in which other communities who have made their own spaces, how they've done that, and center that in our rethinking.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, and I think your point about how these things are already happening is quite important. I mean, I guess I was wondering for you, Aisha, as a younger person, do you think this is something that you see possible when you're with your peers, when you're doing your activist work, when you're doing the things that you do?
Yeah, no, I think so. I agree with the economic point of view, having ethical economies, having cooperative economies, like changing the way we value labour, what is worth getting paid or like given something of value for. Like, I do think if we had this sort of like perfect city where people's efforts were valued, then we'd get firstly higher paid women of colour, no glass ceiling, these sort of structural boundaries wouldn't exist. And then within an institution or within student movements, there hopefully would be no need for a lot of student movements to exist. But if they do exist, then the effort and work and, if anything, emotional like investment that's put into it is acknowledged and appreciated, whether it's via money, via position, via opportunities like these. I think that a lot of what is done by students is just not acknowledged, and I think that if we did have this perfect city, it would be a place where either we didn't have to do it, or it would be students being asked to speak at great events like this and being advertised by the university as these amazing people rather than just pushed aside and tokenized, essentially.
So moving back a little bit, I guess, one of the questions that I had listening to all of you talk really was, there are all these wonderful examples of ways that people are trying to remake their cities and remake place. But I think we can also think of the city as a space of surveillance, as a place that puts up these boundaries, as a place that encloses. And I think that has particular ramifications for women of color, particularly queer and trans women of color. And I guess what I would wonder is, how do you navigate the kind of tensions between creating the sorts of communities that, for instance, Nicole, you're talking about, while also avoiding the kind of tendency to enclosures, a tendency to kind of surveillance, those kinds of things?
Do you mean surveillance by the state or internal surveillance?
I mean both.
Okay.
I mean both.
Well, I think So the U.S. context, because it does become a bit different than the U.K. in terms of state surveillance and police. And this is the whole point of Black Lives Matter coming up into the U.S. context, was because of this harsh surveillance of this police state, right, within Black and brown communities. That's a tricky question. Now, I align more with the new abolitionist movement that Angela Davis was talking about in the 1960s, and even before her, that BLM has taken up now, is that we have to think about what does it mean to dismantle a police state in order to then think about restorative justice as a location in communities so they can take care of themselves. And I think a lot of times when we think about surveillance and policing, and again, I'm focusing on the U.S. context here because the UK is different in the ways in which they do surveillance. I think that we have to understand where the history, so again, histories matter even more so than now than ever, is when we think about what policing came in, it became a way in which the system of slavery was then reenacted and reimagined to still police certain bodies, right? And the prison industrial complex becomes one of those new articulations of what a slavery looks like in the present day. And so if we're thinking about imagining new cities and new communities, I think we have to really take a hard look at what it means to systematically dismantle state surveillance and then bring that kind of quote unquote policing into communities with restorative justice. And again, that's being done. BYP, Black Youth Project in Chicago, is doing that. When Hoffman, I don't know how many know about the Holman Square incident in Chicago, when the Black Ops site that many of us knew was going on for years, and it finally came to light in this big expose. Black and brown queer communities took over that space for the whole summer, and they created basically a city within a city where there was no money being exchanged, but it was knowledge and people, and they would practice sort of justice there. So I think that's one way. It's not perfect, but I think that's one way we can start imagining something a little bit different, so that we can think about what liberation looks like and not just surviving.
Mm-hmm. And do you have anything to add from the UK context, Sumita?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily from the UK context, but just kind of responding to some of Nicole's points. I think you mentioned kind of self-care. I think support networks and just support for these organisations and movements and groups, as Aisha was saying as well, is really, really important. And just also that in terms of thinking about surveillance, it's not only kind of state surveillance or community surveillance, there are also patriarchal structures in domestic settings as well that we need to be aware of as well, and some of the challenges that all women, but women of colour often face in a kind of a domestic role that is really hard to challenge.
Mm-hmm. I think some of the buzzwords that we hear quite often when we hear about the future of cities now are things like the happy city, the playable city, the smart city, the city as laboratory, these kinds of things. And yeah, I'm just wondering from your own perspectives as women of color engaging in the debates and movements and activism around the future of cities, what your reaction is to those kinds of terms and those sorts of concepts of the future of cities. You might want to go first, Aisha.
I think I will.
Yeah.
I think these sort of cities, the smart city, it's all from a very environmental, scientific way, but not from a social way. I feel like when we're trying to improve our city, we're trying to improve transport, trying to make everything hyper efficient, but then we don't look at the basic things like social inequality within a city. Take Bristol with St. Paul's, Lawrence Hill. There's such a divide, and then the Clifton campus that we set up at the top of the hill. There's such a divide within that, and there are engagement projects that are being done, but I feel like not enough expertise or not enough work is going into that as much as, say, sustainability of Bristol and how we pride ourselves in being a green city, which is great, but do we pride ourselves in being an inclusive city? I'm not so sure if we do.
Mm-hmm.
I worry about some of these terms, which, as I say, they're kind of forward-thinking, and they forget about the shared histories. The histories of these cities, and they kind of, as Nicole was saying, they forget about the ways in which communities are being displaced by lots of these projects. So I think we need to be really careful about who we imagine in these cities when we use those kind of labels.
Mm-hmm. And is that the kind of terminology that comes up in the U.S. context at all, Nicole?
No.
No.
I mean, we talk about, you are seeing a rise, a very fast rise in major cities really going through a gentrification process. So land is being seen in different ways in tech. So I guess smart in terms of tech companies in the city the little town that, or it's a little city that I work in with the college, is trying to do that. So there was a big New York Times article ran about Diane Hendricks, who is a billionaire woman, the third richest woman in the States, who lives in the city, who's on Trump's council. And there was ways in which she's trying to she's revitalizing the downtown area and bringing tech companies in. But then my question is, who are they going to hire? Because they're not going to hire the demographics of the town, right? So when we're bringing companies in and we want to be more efficient, want to be more smart, again, intersectional lens is not just about identity, it's about all aspects of power and initiatives. So we're talking about sustainability or green, in technology and efficiency. What's more efficient than many of the communities we come from who have been doing recycling? You know, this idea of mason jars that people love now, it's like everyone's been doing that since we were growing up, right? You know, if you're poor, you're going to use, there's ways in which being what we call poor, there's an asset there that we understand how to navigate a space in ways that those who've not had to go through that can imagine. So when we're thinking about what efficient means, I completely agree. How are we understanding the ways in which these things like race, class, and gender impact how we even understand and define those terms? So I think this one-size-fits-all approach to the problem, we can't make, it's like when I was living in Bristol and I saw that big ball in the middle of the downtown, I was like, I'm in Chicago. We have one of those too. You know what I mean? Like,
it's just back there. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like why are we trying to almost sanitize and do as one size fits all? We can box up a city and then dump it somewhere else, kind of thing. What happens what's the problem with people thinking about location in different ways to make community and make what a city could be using these terms? So I guess it's kind of all over the place, but I think a big part of it is thinking about what lens, again, what questions are we using to frame when we talk about smart cities, green cities, sustainable cities, things like that.
So we're going to open up to questions from the audience in just a minute. I'm just going to ask the panelists one more question before turning it to you, so please do start thinking about what you'd like to ask them. Sumita, you mentioned it, and there's no way I was going to let you mention it without asking. You were talking about symbols and statues. What do you think about symbols and statues, e.g. Colston?
So I think statues have, as I was kind of saying, statues have lots of power. The symbols that we use make a part of the identity of a city or a nation and so forth. So when we think about whether we have them or not, we need to think about why. It's not very articulate, but they're so contested. They have so much more meaning beyond just being a piece of art that we need to really acknowledge the greater layers of meaning that they have. And perhaps statues aren't the best symbols that we should use for history. Lots of symbols from history are used, which are kind of like fake history. There's so many narratives and myths about history which, if you look at the historical record, aren't correct. But here we are, and history is, as I said, is used so much in informing identities, communities, and so forth, that we need to think beyond statues. And if we want to use a space and use some kind of art, we need to move beyond individuals as well and think more creatively about how we use art as historical symbols.
I guess that also goes back to your point about move beyond kind of putting all this symbolic value on individuals.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just add to that about, there's a lot of contested buildings and things in Bristol, like Colston, but also Will's Memorial Building. There was a huge movement by a group of black students to rename Will's, and it was an online campaign on Facebook, and it just received an onslaught of critique by mostly white students and also black students being like, we're not those people who want to rename something. But it just became this thing about as though it was something superficial, as though it didn't mean anything, but it does mean something to black students. Like, Bristol is historically a university that was built on slavery, is funded by slavery. A lot of the buildings are built on what they gained from it, and it's, you just can't ignore that, and I feel like the response was just wanting to shove it under the carpet and ignore it. And whether or not the building got renamed wasn't the point, it was the fact that we were trying to bring it up, and the fact that it was making students feel uncomfortable, and the fact that students didn't really know the history of Colston, or know, like, and accommodation is named after him. And it's just like, we don't really understand the histories of Bristol, and that's not educated and shown through an academic institution, which is shocking. So we have to understand the symbolism that statues, buildings, libraries that we have to work in every day, they have an impact on the student experience and how we navigate this city.
And I mean, Nicole, obviously in America this has been a huge issue.
Just a little bit.
Just a tiny bit. A little bit of news about it. I mean, why? Why have people been reacting like this to statues?
Well, I think people are tired, right? I think monuments tell you about what a state wants you to believe about itself, right? And it also tells you who they value and what they value. And so the Confederate statutes have always been an issue, and people have raised that throughout time, but I think we're in a time and place now with things like Movement for Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, and other organizations and students. So students have always led the way, and I think we need to pay attention to students more than we do in society. Because it was when Mizzo erupted in 2014, and you saw this kind of this resurgence of black and brown student political activism emerging once again, it made sense that the next thing to go to is the Confederate statutes, right, and for the Confederate flag. And again, when Bree Newsom, a black woman, climbed that pole, right, and took that flag down, I think it kicked off in the States an understanding of why history matters, and then how it's being used, right, to push to basically normalize white supremacy once again. And so with the election of our 45th president, there's been this kind of emboldening, right, in the public where the sheets have come off and people stand proud in their tan khakis and their white polo shirts, tiki torches, right, to kind of talk about, yes, this is our history. And part of it is like, well, yeah, they're right. This is what the states have told us matters. This is what we have been kind of conditioned to believe is what the nation state is, what America is. It is a white supremacist country, and so I think with the statues coming down, it's the population is saying we no longer want to literally walk through and walk by and live in these locations that basically pay homage to those who, quite frankly, if you're going to go by the law, are traitors, right? And so I think monuments matter, and I completely agree. I think taking them down becomes a physical representation of the ways in which people are just kind of getting tired of having who they are ignored and somehow being seen as they're the problem, when actually the problem is the normalcy and the normalizing of white supremacist thought into action, which is starting at the top.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
In this case, yes.
Yeah.
So I'd like to turn to you for questions. If you have a question and you raise your hand, we have a roving mic that it can come around, and we would ask that you wait for the mic to come. We'd also ask that you try to keep your questions relatively brief, just so we can hear as many voices as possible. So we have some in the front.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for your comments. I'm just wondering about the role of virtual cities and online locations in the development of physical cities.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard that. It was a question about virtual and online spaces and cities in the development of the actual physical city. Thoughts from our panel?
It's powerful. So I feel like I'm talking a lot, so please, you can interrupt. Okay. So I think we saw in 2010 when Arab Spring, I believe it was 2010, Arab Spring erupted, we saw the power of social media, right? And social media has become a space that marginalized communities can access to get their information out, right? We know, so thinking about traditional days of publication, op-eds and things like this, they have been geared more toward cis white men's voices and those who have come through certain locations. And so things like, especially Twitter, where you can just literally get things out and it go fast, has shown what it means for a community to be global. And so when Ferguson erupted in 2014, you saw the power of imagined communities through social media when people in Gaza and people in Egypt were tweeting people in Ferguson how to face tear gas, right? When you saw people literally putting in, after 2014, 2015, 16, now to the present day, Black Lives Matter, when London came, when London did their protest in Bristol, then you went down to Brazil, right, back to Palestine. You're seeing the ways in which virtual communities are being created so that there's an idea of solidarity that again is not different, right? 1960s and 70s, Angela Davis, right, with Barbara Ramsby and Beverly Guy Sheffield, and to the present day, went over into Palestine, thinking about what are the ways in which we can start building this kind of community so that we can talk about different ways of knowing and being. So then you got Cuba coming in, you've got the African resistance, liberation coming in. So we're just seeing the use of technology doing what people used to do in the past, and that is come together because who they are globally in terms of system of oppression are operating very similarly. And now I think with social media, we're just seeing it happening quicker. So I think it's going to be going to the future and the idea of smart cities, right, and tech. I think we're actually going to start seeing a bit more of these kind of virtual communities that a lot of folks in the margins have had to use to create community, right? And it allows us to go beyond ability issues and things like that. We're going to see that, I think, on a powerful mechanism of both the state using it to maintain the state, but also people using it for resistance. And I think that's really actually a good thing.
Yeah. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree with Nicole, but we also shouldn't be so, we shouldn't necessarily be so utopian in our ideals about online media or just online communication for a number of reasons. There are people who don't have access to online media because of state surveillance and just because of poverty and kind of just general access. There are issues around language as well, the ways in which, of course, the English language is something that is the dominant means of medium in which people are communicating. If we think about these spaces, so as much as it's a really great tool, and kind of think about virtual online cities are great tools for bringing people together who might not meet each other otherwise and can share ideas and activism and so forth. There are still people who are still excluded from these type of areas. We need to always be conscious of that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think technology and having a virtual community does have a double-edged sword. Obviously, as a student, the online is how I campaign, how we seek solace, how we create safe spaces for marginalised groups, online platforms to provide a therapeutic way to get out all of your anger against society, things like that. But then, and also it's a way to mobilise groups, protests, talks, things like that. But then equally, it also lends itself to a superficial way of wanting to be part of a cause. So things like putting a little filter over your profile picture and, pray for Paris. It's like these are ways that we think we are actually helping a cause without actually having, again, to do anything. It's like I can be like, oh, interested in race, gender, future of cities, but not attend it and not really learn from it, and then not use what you've learned in your daily life to improve society around you. And again, things like surveillance and things like that, like how safe are these spaces if they're online? I just think that it's a very useful tool, but then it's also just a very useful thing to have and have a surface level interest in something without actually being productive in helping a cause.
Can I push back a little bit on that? Because I agree with you, but I think people talk about slacktivism a lot, but I think we have to also think about ability, right, and mental health. And many times the social realm has been a place where people who can't be on the front line can use, right, to engage. And I think about terms like misogynoir, right, that became a really critical term, misogynoir being from Dr. Moya Bailey, when she was an academic, but she took the term and put it into an online blog, Crunk Feminist Collective, and that took off virtually by online activists who were able to talk about this complex relationship between Black women's oppression globally, right? So I think, I see both sides, and I think everything's got two sides, but I think when it comes to thinking about reach and how people are learning, right, how people are gaining knowledge about different systems and different ways of being, I still think there's a value there that I don't want to overlook just because there's always going to be a pushback, right, to whatever is the newest thing. Kind of, so I completely agree. I just think I want to just kind of put that perspective into those kind of critiques that I hear a lot as well.
So there are a bunch more questions all around in the back. I think maybe if we start there and kind of move our way back, that would be the best.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much so far. It's been really interesting. My question is for Nicole. I'm just interested to find out a bit more about what you found about racism or race in the UK. I think you said in your initial introduction that you were told it was all about class, and I just wondered whether that's still your opinion. And just to say that from my own personal experience, I think the real tragedy in terms of race or racism being swept under the carpet in the UK is that we're not taught about it. I just remember back in history at school, we learned about Nazi Germany, we learned about the slave trade in the USA. Doesn't have anything about the colonisation of the British Empire or the transatlantic slave trade in the UK.
Yeah, the UK is not that different. You're just nicer. And I say that on purpose, right? Because this British niceness, right, allows one to kind of skirt around the issue at hand, right? And the US has that too, but we're just a little bit more direct with it. I think this is where I find community organizations need to become vital in uncovering these hidden histories and putting to the forefront. The whole purpose only reason why I came to the UK initially, again, was to look at this idea of race in the UK context. But then when I was doing my research, I found there was not a lot written about the Black minority ethnic community organizations that I was studying, right? And so I'm trying to make an argument about this idea I call racialized citizenship, the ways in which citizenship and race collide to have differential access to rights if you become a racialized being. And it's complex because when you come from the diaspora or the Commonwealth, right, you're not necessarily black or browned there because you're the majority, but coming into these kind of these ex-colonial empire spaces, the racialization process is really disrupting, and it's hard to understand and make sense of. In the U.S., we can talk about it more because we settled internally. We're a settler colonialist state, right? So we brought them over to one location, then wiped out and embraced. And so I think we started HLF with Sadhu and I. We did it because we wanted to basically do the research ourselves. And I think a lot of other organizations, Birmingham had one, I forget the name of it, but Birmingham at the time in 2010 was really starting to lead in the third sector on getting this research and this understanding and theorizing out. And so I think in the present day, you're seeing a lot more of it, but I really do think there needs to be more British folks theorizing about the British context when it comes to the intersections of race, class, and gender and sexuality. And we're starting to see more of that. I know David, I'm going to completely mess up his last name, David Olusuga. His work has been, I think, pretty seminal in putting it out in the public in a written form so that we have to also realize that America is not that special, right, in terms of our race and racism, but also learning that we can also put our understandings of race into another context, and then somehow that's going to help us understand what's going on. So I guess long story short, I'm finding that the research and the understandings coming from the ground, coming from BME communities, become more vital. And I think a lot of the work that BSWN's been doing, a lot of organizations, BASA, and then a couple in Birmingham, and also student activists who are now finding their racial consciousness, are pushing to the forefront in the UK a conversation that's always been there. That Gilroy and Stuart Hall's kind of offspring started in the 70s and 80s, when you had this black political consciousness coming through. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Some more questions. Gentleman in the back.
Hello, I personally struggle, and it's a personal struggle, I'd love the panel's view on this, by taking a gender or race or intersectional perspective, do we permit effectively and allow effectively a simultaneous backlash, which is what we're seeing in terms of the growth of white nationalism? And are we actually advancing a polarization in that process? And I know we could say, well, that, yeah, it's happening and we're responding to it. Is there a meta position that we have to end up taking to be able to stop this kind of increasing polarization that we're seeing now, and the kind of advance of a white nationalist conversation which is being legitimated? And I often end up sort of looking for a more humane picture for everyone as my theoretical position, but often get criticised by people who are specialising in this arena. And I just would love the panel's thoughts on how they feel this discourse, is it actually societally helpful right now, or are we simultaneously actually advancing a white nationalist perspective on the other side in this kind of divide? I just love your thoughts on it.
Well, I definitely don't think that discussing issues around race or class or gender is giving fuel to a white nationalist identity, which is there anyway. I think, so I don't know, so Claudia Rankine was here last week? Yeah, who kind of pushed off this whole festival, and she's talking about how we need to talk about race, of course, in Britain, but also we need to talk about whiteness. And I think maybe when we are talking about all of these identities, we need to be talking about whiteness as well as an identity as well within all these discussions, and that's how we can make sense of some of the things that are going on in contemporary politics, and give some terms and ideas and ways for people who are involved in white nationalist politics to understand what they're doing as well, if that makes sense. But I definitely don't think, I mean, I know after the American election there's lots of talk about identity politics and how identity politics is one of the issues for the election, but I think we've always had identity politics, and I don't think we should shy away from that at all. And for so many people, this identity is important, and we have to think about these multiple identities that everyone has. So no, I wouldn't say that our discussions or any of the work that we're doing could be used in any way to argue that we are fueling white nationalism.
I think there's always going to be pushback with the sort of discourse that we're having. Like, I know there's a lot of accusations about my generation being snowflake generation over political correctness, and but this is just us, again, acknowledging all these multiple identities, plurality of it. And I think it's, perhaps, yes, there is a rise in, like, white nationalism, but just because we're speaking out about the issues that we care about, we shouldn't have to feel responsible for, say, something like white fragility. We're pointing out whiteness, we're pointing out how it affects us, how it affects our experience, how it affects how we navigate spaces. That shouldn't be our burden to bear, that we are then triggering some sort of binary position that it's our fault because I'm pointing out some intersectionality, that it's different for me as a woman of colour than a white woman in a tutorial when we're talking about race. Like, that should be fine. I should be able to bring that up and then not have to trigger some person who's white and make them feel some sort of guilt for how they are, and then usher them off to the right wing. I shouldn't have to feel responsible for that. And you should be unapologetic when you have these conversations, because they are vital to keeping our cause going and keeping us energized and engaged in what we have to do.
Yes. I'm saying yes. And I think, so I hear what you're asking, right? And this is, and so there's a couple of things I want to add to the panel, because I think I agree with everything everyone said. Carol Anderson wrote a book called White Rage, right? And I think we're seeing fragility, but we're also seeing rage. And the rage is this. It's anytime there's social progress that does not center whiteness, right? And I agree completely. We're talking about whiteness and anti-blackness, right? So whiteness, anti-blackness anti-black racism is a global currency right now that allows whiteness to maintain itself. And I think what you're seeing right now, when you see any kind of quote-unquote social progress, there's going to be a backlash. There's going to be, and so Obama administration, all the so-called progress we made, Trump is now backlashing and removing all of that, right? And it's almost, it's completely irrational. And I think that's because there's an assumption being embedded that if we center the margins and somehow the minority become the majority, right, that they will do to whiteness what whiteness did to us. right? And I think that assumption itself tells me more about those who are fearful and moving to these white nationalist things than it tells me about myself, right? Or the panelists up here. And I think that is because there is no humanity when we talk about white supremacy. Right? There could not be. That you had to make people inhuman to then justify and rationalize the enslavement of those people, but also the genocide of those natives on the land. Right? So America is stolen people on stolen land, and we are the descendants of those stolen people whose stolen land people are still there. Right? But that does not mean that if somehow native populations in the New World were somehow able to reclaim their land, that they would do to us what was done to them. But that is the underlying fear. And because of that fear, you're seeing this white lash and white rage and fragility. And I love how you said triggered, because we're not triggered. We can talk about this, right? If I'm telling you that, listen, Black lives do matter. I'm not saying you don't matter, but I'm saying, hey, I do matter too. If your next thing is to be like, well, all lives matter and you're being divisive, I'm just saying something that I think is pretty not radical. But if you think me saying Black Lives Matter is radical, that again is telling me more about your fear of what that means if blackness became a central point of location of humanity. You're afraid of what humanity could actually be. Humanity is not then dependent upon capitalist production, right? Humanity is not then dependent upon what you can do for me, about making sure that there's people who don't make enough so that we can only have 1% have the benefits of the output, right? So I think what you're saying about want to be humane is actually really good, and keep that, but don't base your idea of humanity on the construction of white supremacy, because you're not going to find humanity there. And I think that's what we're seeing, particularly in the U.S., but it's coming in Europe. It's been here in Europe, right? We're seeing it in former imperialist and colonial states. They're afraid because the colonies are now saying we matter.
Great, so there's a question in the back, and then there's a woman right there who's been waiting, and a woman there, so we'll take those first.
Thank you. I've come up today from Plymouth, which is about 2 hours south. And in Plymouth at the moment, there's just the hot thing that's happening is Mayflower 2020, and there's been a kind of big fund that's been launched, and there's lots of debate around whether it should be a celebration or not. And I think that Plymouth can tend to be quite a bit behind the rest of in fact it is behind the rest of their country, and I run a theatre company which is for raising the visibility of people of colour and trying to get more people of colour involved in the arts. And I'm kind of in the process at the moment of having a bit of a debate with myself, because I don't have anyone else to debate with, around kind of, do you apply to do something for the Mayflower, in the sense of kind of going, okay, should I use these resources to show the other stories of it, and then within that kind of going, how useful is it to, because I am the only theatre practitioner of colour in the city, is it my responsibility to then bring up all of those Indigenous stories and represent those Indigenous stories? Should I be talking about the here and now and using the today's stories, or should I be looking to the future? And so that's when I saw that this festival was happening, I was like, oh yes. So if you have any perspective on that, would be fab.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, I think definitely it's about engaging with it rather than ignoring it, because otherwise then it will just be a white space, and the discussion that you obviously really want to involve in it will never take place. So if I can kind of use an example that I'm involved in, so next year, 2018, is the partial centenary of women getting the vote in Britain, and this is a lot of the celebrations are very much about white women getting the vote, about Pankhurst and Fawcett, so voting these kind of white middle class women who are getting the vote. So what I've been trying to do is twofold, trying to bring in perspectives of women of colour who are involved in the British suffrage movement and just raise their stories. And I've been talking to lots of people who are organising events and saying, by the way, can we talk about race here? And also the second thing that I was talking about drawing out global histories and saying, let's not be so British-centric about a women's rights movement, which was so globally linked at the time. And I think if you can start making those conversations, making those inroads, hopefully other theatre practitioners will realise the need to also engage with it, so it won't just be your burden. That's what I've kind of experienced, but yeah, I definitely say don't shy away from it, and yeah, get involved.
Can you explain Mayflower 2020? I don't know what that is.
Sorry, Mayflower 2020.
Yeah, what is that?
If I'm not mistaken, and I fear I'm not because I'm from Boston, actually I grew up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, so hey, what's up? It's the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower taking off from Plymouth, UK.
Okay.
So there was a woman at the front with a
Interesting.
question.
Well, I'd be interested to hear your opinions on, I think the pressures for self-censorship, to some extent it kind of carries on from the question before the last question, where the pressures are that where I don't know whether you know about the latest Football Association saga, where at least one black football player raised concerns about discrimination, and there've been I think 3 investigations into it. And the statement is that you know if you put your head above the parapet, you're in trouble. And I see that happening across the higher education section, where I see it in relation to BME staff and students raising their heads above the parapet and being challenged as though they're troublemakers. I'd be interested to know what you think about ways of calling that out, and also in a connection in relation to the misattribution of history, and I'd call that propaganda rather than history quite a lot. So, yeah.
I mean, Aisha, do you want to start just
Yeah.
from the student perspective?
Yeah, I think with that, yeah, I know that staff at our university have had an issue and then were offered to make a network or some group to help cope with racism they might find in the workplace, and they didn't like that because it felt tokenized, and then they formed their own advisory group, BAME advisory group, which is the equivalent of the student version. And I think it is a sort of space where you can seek solace and essentially just say, oh, this person, they said this and they were quite racist to me. But then again, it's kind of like it's just grouping people together who are sad about racism in the institution, and it doesn't actually address it and doesn't actually change policy or inclusivity or equality, diversity, and things like that. I think that networks are great and groups are great, but only if they have like a purpose, and like, yeah, just like you said, just ignoring it or just getting on with your job or your work isn't really the solution to what needs to be done, and that these groups need to push institutions or companies or whatever you're working in to be like, that's not okay. And it's a shame that people who do that are labelled as troublemakers. It's a shame that happens, but you have to not let that stop you from doing what you think is right. And it is really hard in an institution because you're met with a lot of these measures who are often led by white people, and you're like, yeah, okay, I've got this group, I can talk to people about my issues, but it's important to acknowledge that it's on their terms and you need to make it on your terms. And if that makes you a troublemaker, then so be it, in my opinion.
Do you have anything to add, Nicole or Sumita?
Yeah, I mean, just on the football case, also the 2 questions. I mean, on the football case, her England career was ruined by coming forward, but she kept on coming forward, and obviously she had the legal background in order to do this, and so many people didn't believe her. Her teammates ostracised her, but she kept on coming forward, and at least last week, or a few days ago now, with the case, at least now the truth is out, as it were, and she's kind of been vindicated in a way for everything that she did, although her career has been lost. So she had the, I guess, the networks and the professional background training that she could risk her career for this, and lots of women can't risk their careers to put their head above the parapet. But if you are able to have that strength and to be bold, then of course it will pave the way for so many other women of colour, as it will hopefully do with the FA. So all power to her for doing something which will hopefully have repercussions beyond just the FA as well, about this racist bullying that can take place in the workplace. And in terms of misappropriated history, yes, it isn't history sometimes. Yes, it is misappropriated, but even if it's, as I said, kind of fake history, it's still being used, so we still need to engage with it and work out the best ways in which we can either challenge these histories which are incorrect, or kind of use retell those stories to engage more people the best ways.
I think another example.
What I meant was I think it ought to be called propaganda when it is propaganda.
Yes, okay, yeah. Yeah, sure.
I think another example as well of what you're talking about is Sarah Ahmed, who is a professor at Goldsmith University of London, and last year, was it now?
Last year.
Quite publicly resigned over racism and sexism at the institution. She has the power of the networks that she can do that sort of thing. I think I wanted to pick up on something though from Aisha's response that also links to something from the young woman from Plymouth mentioned that I don't think anyone answered, which was this question of the obligation or responsibility that is thrust upon BME people. So, you know, if you're the only BME theater practitioner in a city, are you obliged to educate everybody about this? Or if you are a BME staff member, are you obliged to form a lobbying group and try to change university policy? I mean, I'm just wondering what you all think about that, because that to me seems like another form of unpaid emotional and sometimes physical labor that can be actually psychically really devastating to BME people.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I wanted to touch on that question as well, in that, like, you are often faced with this sort of internal debate, like, do I do this? Do I point this out? Like, in a tutorial, if someone says something inappropriate, do I be the one who calls them out? But then I'm that girl who calls everyone out on, like, their inappropriate remarks, and that labels me and further isolates you from a situation. And I think it isn't fair that we have to do this. But equally, sometimes you are forced. Either you just ignore it, but then someone said something racist or someone said something inappropriate, like how you internalize that. And it's almost like this isn't a hobby that we do. This isn't like anything I like to do on the side that I enjoy. This is something that we're fighting for, like basic rights. And if that is, if someone says a microaggression and you're like, hey, that wasn't okay, that should be okay to do. But then again, yes, it's so draining and tiring to be that person. And like in my report, people were like, I feel like I'm the one who has to do it. And like, that's not fair. But then equally, this is something that is thrust upon us. It's some people do choose to not say it, and they are able to enclose themselves, isolate themselves, create a bubble around to think, oh, that's not about me. But then other people like myself, I can't ignore it. And I feel like it is, I think you should try and diversify this show, and that I think it's important. But I do understand it is difficult when you're in this white space and you're not in control, and then you do feel like this responsibility is on you. But just, I would say, just try your best, and you're only human. Do like what's within your capacity. Thing like Audre Lorde, like talking about self-care, it's about self-preservation, and that's something that's really important. Whenever you're involved in any of these sort of things, it's about thinking, I'm doing this for me, but if you can't, then don't do it. Like, it's just how you've got to sort of gauge what you think is right in the situation and what's right for you personally.
Yes. And I want to pick up, I love you. I want to pick up on what you mentioned. You talked about Audre Lorde, because Audre Lorde also talks about the uses of anger, right? And so a lot of times, I've been called the angry black woman. I don't know how many, I think I was out the womb, I was an angry black woman, right? And then on top of that, I'm 6'3", I'm big, you know, so there's ways about me that my physical presence in a room is already disruptive. I'm not supposed to be there, right? So if I'm not supposed to be there, then why the hell not just use it? Right? And so I think Audre Lorde talks about, and it's kind of this idea of black feminist refusal that's radical, in that if I'm always going to be seen as angry, whether I speak or not, whether if I can fix my face or not in the room, then what does it mean to use that anger as fuel, right, to push for social change? And this is where Bell Hook's idea of being transgressive comes in. So you can't use the master's tools to build the master's house, but you can repurpose those tools in ways never imagined when they're in the hands of people never supposed to be there. So I was thinking, is now that I know what the Mayflower thing is, as you asked about it, and it's kind of also addresses your question about, you know, do you want to be seen as the one that's coming out and doing this stuff? What would it look like in a space that's celebrating essentially settler colonialism to provide information on what that even is, right? What does it mean to use a space and disruption not having to be you stand up in it and yell and scream, but be in that space and all of a sudden you're putting on information that allows for a complete picture of that celebration of Plymouth Rock, right? And this is where these things like hashtag syllabi have become so useful. After Charleston, when Charleston happened, do y'all know what Charleston, the 9 that were shot, and the 9 black people were shot by the white supremacists? People were like, how did this happen? Oh my God. Well, it happened because it's been brewing for a long time, and it's not the first location of mass genocide of black and brown folk in a setting. So black academics came together on Twitter. Again, I do love Twitter. On Twitter, and said, can we start sourcing material so that we can kind of get people to understand how we got here? And out of that was born the hashtag Charleston syllabus, right? And since then, people have, every time a major event has happened that people have a shock about how did this happen, people have been using the realm of social media to start gathering information that then puts it out there so people can start to engage with it. And in that collecting of intellectual thought in the public sphere, that is really transgressive, right? That's transgressive when you think about what do people burn first? They don't burn bodies, they burn books, right? Knowledge becomes the ways in which we can think about how we understand propaganda and not see it as actual fact in history. And so I think, okay, I'm sorry, I'm starting to go off. But basically, when it comes down to it, I think we have to not be afraid to be seen as somehow not normal, because we already are not normal. We're not normative, right? We're not supposed to even be in the space. I'm first generation low income from the South Side Chicago. I should have 5 kids or be dead, and that is being very frank. Right, that I really should be. And I'm the first time family to go to college and also finish. And I'm seeing students, just like you, that's why I love you, coming through, right, who are not supposed to be in these predominantly white institutional spaces, being there. And not only are they being there, they're using that space to create their own space and be unapologetically who they are. And I think the youth are teaching us what it means to be unapologetic and who we are as a way to push forward and not worry about being divisive, but actually worry about what it means to bring to not just center the same old, because we don't want to just keep surviving in these streets. We want to actually thrive and be able to leave something for future generations so that it's not the same old reproduction. So I completely agree. I think it is thinking about yourself as not just something to be shulled in. What would it look like if you actually said, I'm here, so when are we going to hear me? Right, and we're already doing it. People are already doing that, and I think we should just take the lead sometimes and let youth tell us how to do it.
So I'm very sorry. I know that there are several more people who'd like to ask questions, but we are, in fact, completely out of time, and we do have to vacate the room because there are more events coming up, so we can't just occupy Watershed Cinema 3. I would like to signal for you that if you are interested in keeping up with what the Festival of Ideas is doing, please do go to our website, sign up for the newsletter, follow us on Twitter. There are also a couple more Festival of Future Cities events happening today, so you can try and engage with those. But beyond that, please join me in thanking our panelists for their time and generosity. And also Black Southwest Network for putting this together.